The following program is paid for and sponsored by Life Extension Foundation.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Richard Peretz, and our program today is with Lowenthal Marcus and Jerome Marcus of Z Street, an organization that supports Israel with a view to honest media reporting and peaceful and just solutions. We'll hear their views on these subjects following these messages. With us now are Lowenthal Marcus and Jerome Marcus. It's a real pleasure to finally get you on the show. And you, sir, nice to meet you in person. Well, you have Z Street,
yes,
an organization you founded. Tell us about it, please.
I started Z Street because many of us felt as though the organizations that existed in the United States primarily, but further abroad as well, that support Israel were mostly ones that had a very centrist, conservative perspective. And we felt as though there really needed to be an organization that was bold and that was prepared to say, no, we're Zionists, we're proud of it, we want to support Israel in terms of combating terrorists, refusing to negotiate with terrorists, not appeasing terrorists, and that was the position we took. We came out of the box very, very different from the other more centrist mainstream organizations. We also took the final kick in the behind, frankly, from an organization you may have heard of, which is J Street, which is bills itself as pro-Israel, but in fact it does everything but support Israel. And
some people say that J Street actually is just about, in some sense, treasonous. What are your thoughts on that?
Treasonous? Well, I think that they are not interested in what's best for Israel and being supportive of Israel in terms of its survival. What they want is to appease the Palestinian Arabs and force the Israeli government to take direction from progressives in America. J Street also, the J is not for Jewish, and many people thought J Street was, oh, that's J for Jewish, which it isn't at all. It has to do with a street in Washington that doesn't exist. There's a K Street, there's L Street, M, but there was no J, so they say they're the voice that wasn't heard. But I know that many people misunderstood and thought it was supposed to be a Jewish organization. It isn't. That's why we took Z Street as the name, Zionist Street.
What is your organization's view with regard to Israel and U.S.-Israel relations?
Z Street is very focused on providing the information to the general public, information that doesn't come out from the mainstream media or from the centrist and other organizations. It's an educational effort to provide true information, real facts, so that people can decide where they stand based on the full information, not the very limited slice that they otherwise get from the media.
So whereas so many other organizations and members of the media lie by omission, misrepresent the truth, your organization disseminates the facts.
Yes, we make sure that people understand when, for example, someone an Israeli is killed in the territories. The focus isn't settler. The focus is on a human being who was murdered and why they were murdered and how they were murdered. And rather than setting up the situation so that people, really the first response is to blame the victims, which is atrocious and completely incorrect. And also it leads to bias and it leads to people drawing false conclusions. It's very important that Americans and all those who love and care about Israel understand the history of the region. Most people have a very vague sense of what countries are there, how long they've been there, what the sizes are, what led up to the current conflict. And without the information, they really are coming to conclusions in a vacuum without the context. So Z Street really tries to provide a full context and lots of information so that the public can draw firm conclusions based on facts.
Jerome, you've been handling the legal aspect of things, and it's been a long battle, I understand.
Yes.
What is the timeline?
Well, our case was filed in August of 2010, about a month after Lori received some shocking information, which was that the IRS told our lawyers, told Z Street's lawyers, that the reason the application was taking so long was that all applications having to do with Israel were being scrutinized particularly carefully, and that some of those applications were being sent to a special office in Washington, D.C., and I'm quoting now the words of the IRS agent, so that it could be determined whether the organization's activities were consistent with the policies of the Obama administration. I think my wife should explain how she felt when she learned that.
My first response was, frankly, fear. What? The American government is looking into how we think in order to determine whether we're entitled to a tax-exempt status. As a lawyer who used to practice First Amendment law, I know that that's unconstitutional. And I was frightened, then I was just shocked, then I got angry and spoke to my husband, and we decided, let's talk to the Z Street board and see if they're prepared to bring a lawsuit for this outrageous, unconstitutional behavior on the part of the American government.
So the lawsuit was filed about a month later in August of 2010, and it sat for a long, long time. It's now 2016. We're approaching July. So in another month, it will have been 6 years, 6 years from the time that we filed the case until the present time when we have at last, within the last few months, begun the process of actually forcing the IRS and the rest of the federal government to turn over evidence that shows us exactly what they really were doing.
Now, Z Street is not alone in this situation. There are many other organizations that have been subjected to special scrutiny, especially if they are pro-Israel. What is this initiative by the IRS to go after organizations that are pro-Israel?
Well, that's an interesting question. Our case was the first one filed that alleged any kind of IRS political bias in connection with its allocation of nonprofit and tax-exempt status. In the years that followed, in 2011, 2012, other organizations, not primarily pro-Israel organizations, but just political organizations on the right, the Tea Party organizations and other organizations that had positions that were not, to put it mildly, consistent with those of the Obama administration, have alleged, and it's now been confirmed by the IRS itself, that those organizations did indeed receive exactly the kind of conduct that we've alleged in our complaint, namely that their applications for tax-exempt status were simply slow-rolled. And so those organizations were effectively frozen and prevented from engaging in the activities that they have a right to engage in solely because of their political views. And you're correct that a case has been filed and is currently pending in federal court in Ohio, which is a class action. But I'm not aware that any of the organizations in the Ohio case are pro-Israel organizations. What we do know, and what is alleged in our complaint and has documentary evidence attached to our complaint, is that before the IRS disclosed to Lori the kinds of scrutiny that Z Street was being subjected to, that another Jewish organization, which is a purely religious organization having nothing to do with politics, which was seeking tax-exempt status, was asked in writing what its views were on the state of Israel, which is a truly shocking fact, truly shocking. And although I have not been able to learn the identity of that organization, we did obtain a copy of most of the letter that the IRS sent, including the signature page signed by an IRS agent, whose name is Tracy Dornett, posing that question in the context of adjudicating an application for tax-exempt status. In other words, the IRS said in writing, before we can decide whether you're entitled to tax-exempt status, we need to know how you feel about the state of Israel.
Astonishing.
Astonishing.
This is a very unfortunate reality, but I'd like to know, what defenses has the government brought in your suit?
The government has actually taken quite a number of very surprising positions in the case. They began by offering several different, not completely consistent stories about why it was that Z Street's application was taking so long. They suggested that it was an advocacy organization. They then took the rather surprising position that Z Street had to do with Israel, and Israel is a country where there's a lot of terrorism. Therefore, the IRS said, Z Street was being scrutinized particularly intensively because it had to do with a country that had to do with terrorism, and therefore the IRS had to make sure that Z Street wasn't supporting terrorism. Not really sure how that syllogism holds up. But I think probably the most interesting arguments were the legal arguments, because the IRS took the position, first of all, that the First Amendment, which Lori mentioned earlier, and which imposes the obligation on the government to treat all applications without referring to what opinions are held by the applicant. They took the position that the First Amendment only applied to the federal government if the federal government chose to waive sovereign immunity. In other words, that the Constitution, which was created to limit government power, only applied to the government if the government decided that it wanted to let the Constitution apply.
So in other words, the IRS said, with a straight face, oh, you can't sue us even if you're claiming that we're violating the Constitution. Excuse me, but that's why the Bill of Rights was passed. We have the Bill of Rights to protect citizens from the government. And to me, that was so outrageous for them to really take that position and take it repeatedly. It was just insulting. It was really infuriating, to say the least. And they maintained that position until finally the judge just threw it out and said, no, that doesn't apply here. That's inaccurate.
The other legal argument that the IRS made was that there's a statute that says that if you make an application for tax-exempt status and the government hasn't adjudicated it within 270 days, you can simply go to court and seek an order granting you the tax-exempt status. And they claimed, therefore, that we had no injury because all we had to do was wait a little longer and then sue the government for our tax-exempt status. And both the trial court and, after that, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia responded to that argument with really incredulity. And the D.C. Circuit, in particular, in a panel presided over by Judge Garland, who is now President Obama's nominee to the Supreme Court, reacted with anger to the government's lawyer. Because, as the D.C. Circuit pointed out, what the government was essentially saying was, we have the right to discriminate against anybody we want for 270 days. And if we do that, their remedy is not to be free of the discrimination, but simply to then initiate a lawsuit through which, at some point, hopefully, they can get an adjudication of their right to tax-exempt status. Of course, as the history of our own lawsuit shows, the case has been pending for 6 years. Lawsuits are not exactly the fastest way to get relief from the government when it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So that's one reason why that argument is really not so good. But I think what left the D.C. Circuit just astounded and angry was that the government's lawyers would stand up and say with a straight face, we have the right to discriminate for this amount of time. And Judge Garland and the other judges on the panel were incredulous and they were angry. And if you listen to the transcript of the argument, they say "Oh, you don't mean to be saying that, do you?" I'm quoting the judges. And at a certain point, when the government's lawyer, who was a very, very talented and experienced litigator, been in the Justice Department for a long time, said, no, Your Honor, that actually is what I'm saying. The panel said, "Well, you go back and tell your superiors that we're not very happy with that position." And her response was, "Well, Your Honor, many of them are here." So I think they've gotten the message. But now we're in the midst of discovery, and I think it's quite likely that their view is, it's June 30th, we have until January 20th. Our only obligation right now is to run out the string on this case until President Obama is done, and then it will all just go away, which I can assure you it will not.
One of the problems is the public has no idea really what's going on and the complexity of applying for a non-profit organization and the obstacles placed in their way. Please tell us about this.
Well, I think that many people probably believe that the IRS is a neutral arbiter. They may understand at some level of depth that one is permitted to apply for tax-exempt status. And I'm sure that most people would expect, everybody should expect, that when an application like that comes in, it's treated fairly, and that we don't say Democrats can have them and Republicans can't, or black people can't have them and white people can. We don't do things like that in America. And I think most people would expect that the IRS doesn't do things like that. I can tell you that when our case was first filed, the response that it met with from tax professionals began with incredulity and went downhill from there. We were accused of being kooks because we had the temerity to allege that the IRS was doing the very thing that an IRS agent told our lawyers the IRS was doing. We were lunatics because we were alleging such a thing. Now, what's the fraction of the American population that thinks about how the IRS allocates tax-exempt status? I'm sure it's a very small number. What's the fraction of the American people that thinks the IRS is being fair? I don't know. But I think that our case, as I think I mentioned earlier, is devoted in significant part simply to forcing the IRS to disclose what it is really doing, how it's going about the process of granting or not granting tax-exempt status, or even just sitting on things for a while because it slows things down. How does it decide how long something is supposed to take? And our hope is that we can force the information out into the open, and then we have to rely on Justice Brandeis. Sunlight is the best of disinfectants. So you have to hope that when the evidence is there, that we will put it out, people will care, people like you will help us bring it to the attention of the American people, and that the American people will understand what's at stake and that they will care.
This is really very interesting, but I'm afraid we must pause for this commercial break. We'll be right back. We're back with Lowenthal Marcus and Jerome Marcus. I'd like to change topics for a moment and ask you what your views are with regard to the alleged scandals in the IRS. A certain lady who's been subjected to some...
I can a little bit. I assume you're referring to Lois Lerner. The answer is I can't see behind that curtain just yet. We don't know what the IRS really has done, why they did it, who was doing it inside the IRS, whether it was really being driven by Lois Lerner and some employees in Ohio, or whether it was being driven by somebody else somewhere else. I would find it a little bit odd that somebody in an office in Cincinnati would suddenly take it into their heads to advance the political positions of J Street or people who disagreed with some of the things that Z Street has said or that my wife has said. So I'm curious to find out exactly where the impetus for this policy came from. And that's one of the things that I hope to learn in the course of discovery in this case.
As a matter of principle, what does it mean to you both that the government can want to influence organizations and more than that, with their ability and power, as we've discussed in this conversation?
Well, that's why I was so frightened for the first instant when I heard what the government had done in our case in terms of subjecting my organization, because of our views, to special scrutiny when it should have absolutely nothing to do with whether or not this organization or any other is entitled to tax-exempt status. It's frightening, and it's not how our system of government was set up. And unless people stand up and are prepared to take on the government and the big, scary Internal Revenue Service, the government gets away with it and becomes less and less of the America we know and love, and more of a very different form of abusive government.
I think it would be useful to add this fact. We're far from the only organization that was affected in this way. I, as Z Street's lawyer, have been contacted by counsel for other organizations that have been affected, and there's a class action in Ohio on behalf of hundreds of organizations.
Jerome, what reforms with the IRS would you like to see?
I'd like to see the IRS follow the rules that are already there. I think that the rules that we're enforcing, or seeking to enforce in this case, banning discrimination on the basis of viewpoint, those rules are there. Rules that prevent politics from influencing what the IRS does, there are a lot of rules like that. Why? Because the IRS has been used in somewhat similar ways before. We all remember, at least some of us who are old enough to remember that during the Nixon administration, the IRS was used or President Nixon wanted to use it as a tool to go after his enemies. And he was not the first president to do that. And over time, as such efforts have been conducted and then exposed, there are quite a number of rules that bar the IRS from being used in that way, and that make it difficult for anybody at a political level to exert that kind of political influence. What we're finding now is that those rules have been breached, and that it's our job, I think, as American citizens and people who have been affected by this sort of abuse, it's our duty to go to court and unmask it. And one of the things that we have made very clear in our case is that we're not seeking in this case to obtain a tax exemption. What we're seeking is two things. One, accurate and complete disclosure of what the IRS actually was doing. What were they really doing? What was the policy that really animated the IRS? How could it possibly be that some low-level functionary in Cincinnati could mistakenly disclose the truth and say, well, all applicants for tax-exempt status that have to do with Israel are receiving special scrutiny, and some of those organizations are being sent to a special office in Washington. She didn't write that out herself. She didn't make that up. Where in the world did that come from? And it's our obligation to find out where that came from. At whose instance was that policy created? And the second thing we're seeking is simply a fair policy. We just want our tax exemption application to be reviewed fairly and let the government decide things according to the rules as they're supposed to be. I think that the prospect of taking on the Internal Revenue Service is a very, very scary one. And I think that it discourages, I know that it discourages a tremendous number of people, not just from filing a lawsuit, but even from fighting back. So I think that it's quite possible, in fact I think it's likely, that in the same way that quite a number of other initiatives of this administration have been carried out not by passing a law, but simply by implementing a policy that just has an effect, I think that's what we're seeing here. And I would add that one of the bizarre things about our case is that notwithstanding what this IRS agent told our lawyers, the IRS's principal defense in this case is that we don't have a policy like that. There is no such policy. Which means that when we say, well, where's the policy written down? Their answer is, oh, well, there is no such policy, so it's not written down. Which just leaves one shaking one's head. Well, how did this Diane Gentry person, the IRS agent who told our lawyers this, how did she get that into her head? Did she make it up? Was there nothing written down anywhere? But the IRS's defense is there's nothing written down. One of the scary things is, what if that's true? What if it's true that there's nothing written down and it's just something that was discussed? This would be a good idea. How scary would that be?
Such very questionable abuse is occurring not only with regard to political organizations, but others as well. Our main sponsor for many, many years and decades, Life Extension Foundation, has been subjected to abuse and scrutiny and ridiculous allegations, even by the FDA. They advocated the use of many aspirins long before others realized the value, and there was a case where walnuts were regarded by the FDA as a food supplement that should be, have special certifications on it. Ridiculous things.
Walnuts?
Yeah, walnuts, yeah. So Life Extension Foundation, and then the IRS abused them, allegedly, and a long battle with an organization that is just trying to research diseases of aging. And interesting that it isn't only limited to political organizations, but many others. Well, I guess that's a question for another program, not today. I'd like to ask you a little bit about your personal lives. You actually are a First Amendment attorney yourself.
I always say I'm a recovered lawyer. I used to practice First Amendment law, and I left that field quite a while ago, and then became a journalist and did several other things. But because of my background, I understood that what the government's response to our application was way out of bounds and unconstitutional.
Jerome, tell us about your background.
I'm a litigator. I have the good fortune to be married to this lady. I've been practicing law for, 30 years this year. Graduated from law school 30 years ago. That's depressing. Worked for the government for a while and have been in private practice since 1993.
What are your views on the ever-changing scene in the Middle East? Some people say we are returning to something reminiscent of the pre-Sykes-Picot agreement. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's why Z Street was so important. So many people don't understand the history of the region, the facts about the region. When you ask people how large is Israel or what the percentage of the Middle East is comprised of Israel, they're so far off. They think Israel is huge, and they think that Israel took the land that belonged to people they call the Palestinians. The Palestinian Arabs have been brilliant with the use of communication and public relations. Israel, not so much. And so the language has become one of Israel's greatest enemies, and because of that, people's understanding is really distorted. And most people, the reflexive response is, oh, the Jews took the land from the Arabs. They should give it back. When in truth, there was never a Palestinian state. There was no Palestinian government. There was no Palestinian currency. The area was called Palestine for reasons that had nothing to do with the people who today call themselves Palestinians.
So interesting, really. Why does the media dwell on negatives and single Israel out, whereas worse events that occur elsewhere seem to be ignored?
I think that's a very big question that it's really not possible, at least in my mind, to answer with complete certainty. I think Israel is a unique country in many ways. It's obviously the Jewish state. I can't believe that's totally unrelated to the kind of treatment it receives at the hands of the world. But I would add this. I think in many ways this is a time when there is a tremendous opportunity for Israel and most of the countries in the Middle East. Israel's relationship with Egypt, its relationship with Saudi Arabia have never been better. They have never been more public. And I think that there is a dawning awareness, not just among the Egyptians or the Saudis, but among the world at large, that the way things have been understood is not accurate, and that understanding needs to change. And I think that portends good things, not only for the Israelis and not only for the Jews, but for the Arabs who live in what is referred to as the disputed territories or the West Bank or the occupied territories or whatever you want to call them. Those people in particular have been radically abused by the people who call themselves their leaders. Abused. And that abuse has been financed by the EU and in some respects by the United States. But I think that with the awareness, for example, that when Gaza was given to the Arabs, that it became a firebase not only against Israel, but also against Egypt. I think there's been an increasing willingness to understand that maybe funding the organizations that are taking billions of dollars in Western aid and not using it to feed their people or educate their people or house their people or provide medical care, but to build tunnels and even inside hospitals to build military bases. Maybe that's not such a good idea. And that, I think, the facts about that come certainly from Z Street, but in my mind anyway, I think there's some hope that those facts are finding their way up to the surface. I think that the leadership in Egypt knows it. They view Hamas as much of an enemy as Israel does, I think. I don't think that's an overstatement. And I think that it's possible with sensible American leadership that awareness could be the basis for a new day in the Middle East. But it requires putting facts on the table, which is what Z Street is all about.
What would you like to add to that?
Well, I was going to say that he's the optimist and I'm the pessimist. I do hope that some of what Jerome just said is accurate. I am fearful that, in fact, much of the truth remains buried. And I would say one of the reasons why there's so much focus and emphasis on what Israel does wrong, there are two reasons. One, Israel is, I believe, the number 2 spot for journalists in the world. It is a highly coveted place to be. And the reason is that there's lots of news happening there, but also Israel is an open society. And although the rest of the region is pretty closed to reporters and there's not freedom of the press, in Israel there is. So people can come and do come and report. And Israel doesn't threaten journalists, but Israel's neighbors do. And so if you want to have access to the leadership and ready access to Arab leadership, hospitable access. I mean, the Arabs know how to throw a nice party and to be good hosts. Israel, not as much. But that's a big reason why there's so much focus on Israel, because there are so many journalists, foreign journalists.
I think what you were about to say was that the Arabs condition that kind of access on telling the right story. So journalists, for example, in Gaza during the last war, who reported on rockets being launched from schools, mosques, hospitals, etc., were given to understand, and I don't mean with a polite explanation, that really wasn't a good idea. And that if they wanted to remain there and remain breathing and remain with access to the leadership, they should not be running stories like that. Not because they weren't true, but just because it wasn't good for their health. Obviously, Israel doesn't do things like that. But that, again, I think just emphasizes the need for an organization that is devoted to just getting the facts out.
Well, 2 countries have made peace with Israel and more are to follow. On an optimistic note, there'd be so much more the entire region would benefit from with peace and cooperation. Let's hope for that. Many people in our audience would like to know more about Z Street. Where are you at right now?
Right now, and for the past almost 6 years, we've devoted our energy to litigating this lawsuit because the IRS told us not only were they going to apply strict scrutiny to us, but they also deep-sixed our application altogether. So they never acted on it. They froze our application. So we could not fundraise, we couldn't do anything other than spend the money as our board decided to go forward and force the IRS to explain themselves, to explain why they did this, took action based on our viewpoint. So Z Street really has been in abeyance for all these years, and we hope to get back and running, but not before we win this fight.
When do you think this will proceed?
Well, it's proceeding now. When will it end? That's a good question. The IRS has begun giving us documents, and at some point I would anticipate actually questioning IRS employees and officials about what they were doing. But I want to make sure that I have the documentary evidence first, because in my experience as a lawyer, if you don't have documents, people have really sadly weak memories. So we want to make sure their memories are as good as possible when we ask them what they were doing back in 2009 about organizations that took positions that might have been, or that engaged in activities that might have been at odds with the policies of the Obama administration.
This has been most fascinating. I want to thank you, Jerome.
Thank you for having us.
And of course, Laurie, a great pleasure. We have to do this again one of these days.
I hope not. I hope we don't have the occasion for it anytime
No, I
soon.
hope we'll have good news and
That would be
celebrate
nice.
it with you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.